Louise, the situation for human rights defenders has deteriorated, particularly during COVID-19. And more than 5 years into the peace process, what are your reflections on where the peace process is at? You know, what's needed with a view to resolving the human rights crisis in Colombia and to achieve a more lasting peace? It would be great to get your kind of sense on that.
Well, nearly 6 years now into the peace process in Colombia, I think it's at a crucial juncture, probably the most crucial since the signing of the peace accord. There have been congressional elections in March, and at the end of this month, there will be presidential elections. With the last elections, the change of government from Juan Manuel Santos, who negotiated the peace deal, to Ivan Duque, whose party was not in agreement with the accord, we saw a major shift in commitment to its implementation. The peace process has faced severe challenges in recent years. Civil society organizations highlight the lack of security in rural areas, the killing with impunity of human rights defenders and former combatants, the slow and disjointed implementation of the accord, especially in areas that really matter to victims of the conflict, such as rural reform, crop substitution, the ethnic chapter, and the gender perspective. However, on a more positive side, to highlight a few things, the FARC have laid down their arms and are fully engaged in the peace process, with the exception of a small group of dissidents. The transitional justice mechanisms established and are functioning, and Colombia has a real possibility for change. The peace accord provides a roadmap which addresses inequality and good governance, as well as measures to end the conflict, as Beatrice was explaining. Where the peace process is now, as it approaches its 6th year, is a complex one. But I'm just going to touch on 3 areas: that of security guarantees for rural communities and human rights defenders, civil society participation, and transitional justice. Following the signing of the peace accord, we saw a considerable reduction in violence in the rural areas. However, we are once again seeing serious human rights violations and a deterioration in the humanitarian situation, which are disproportionately affecting indigenous, Afro-Colombian, and small-scale farming communities. There has been a reconfiguration of the conflict as armed groups that remain, namely the ELN and other guerrilla groups, paramilitary groups, dissidents of the FARC, and criminal groups, fight for control of territory and illicit economies. This reconfiguration of the conflict has become a much more complex scenario for communities to negotiate. We have also seen an increase in violence in rural towns like Quibdó, where poverty and forced displacement are driving young people into working for drug gangs. Right now, we are seeing armed strikes. That is where armed groups order a curfew. This can be overnight, or they can shut down all movement and order businesses not to operate for days. The UN report that in 2021, nearly 74,000 people were forcibly displaced in Colombia, and that was more than double the figure in 2020. And attacks on civilians also rose by 37%. In addition to forced displacement, communities are being forcibly confined, experiencing selective killings, increased use of anti-personnel mines, and gender-based violence. The Catholic Church and civil society organizations in a report also said that once again, they are seeing collusion between the Colombian armed forces and paramilitary groups on the Pacific coast of Colombia. The Colombian government denies this. The difficulty for communities is that they have invested so much in the peace process. They have suffered so much violence, and they have held on to hope for so long. But that hope is at this moment in time being severely challenged. And I heard from one of the community leaders in Chocó this week, and I'm just going to read a quote to you that I received. Now, maybe Kiwi, you could put up the quote, please. "We are paying for everything. Those of us who have no fault because of the armed paramilitary groups that exist in the region. There is a paramilitary who goes from store to store, notifying all the shopkeepers that they cannot open their business. There are police here. So one wonders, what is the use of the police force if those who rule and those who set the conditions are the groups outside of the law? Despite the peace process, the government response has frequently been to ignore calls for dialogue, turning rather to military solutions, which civil society organisations and communities have been saying only generate greater violence and insecurity. This is supported by findings from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who in their report stated that an increase in the military presence in different areas of the country has not led to an increase in security. What communities are wanting is the implementation from the peace accord of the vedettes. These are the territorially focused development plans. Communities were consulted on these in the first 18 months after the signing of the accord. They are intended to rapidly improve through development programs areas most impacted by the conflict. One of the current weaknesses of the peace process is the government's failure to maintain and create spaces of dialogue with civil society organisations. Inclusive mechanisms established by the Santos government as part of the implementation of the peace accord have ceased to function as they should under the Duque government. When building peace, it is essential to create these spaces to resolve issues through dialogue in order to prevent them from spilling out onto the streets or into violent conflict. Since 2019, Colombia has seen an explosion of social protest due to a range of issues, including the lack of security in the regions, increased poverty, structural inequality, lack of opportunities for young people, and a lack of an integrated implementation of key areas of the peace accord. These social protests have been massive and have covered the whole of the country. Despite the protests being overwhelmingly peaceful, they were met with excessive use of force by the police and army, and many human rights violations were committed. Some protesters were killed, and in several regions of the country, armed civilians in paramilitary style were seen to be operating with security forces, carrying and using guns against the protesters. With mediation from the church and the UN negotiators for the government, the negotiators for the government and the protesters reached agreement. These agreements had some unpalatable things, I think, for both sides. The protest negotiators got agreement and sign-off by the movement, but the government refused to accept what had been negotiated by its representatives, struggling once again with the idea of engagement in effective dialogue with civil society organisations. Along with the insecurity for communities is the lack of security for human rights defenders and former combatants. In the first 2 months of this year alone, according to the non-governmental organisation Indepaz, 36 human rights defenders and 7 former combatants have been killed and 20 massacres committed. In fact, according to the Colombian Commission of Jurists, since the signing of the peace accord in November 2016, more than 1 human rights defender has been killed every other day and 1 former combatant every week. Security is possibly the most dangerous issue threatening the peace process in Colombia. The peace accord established mechanisms to address issues of security, one of which is the National Commission of Security Guarantees, which Linda was talking about. This was established with the objective of constructing policies that will lead to the dismantling of the paramilitary and other criminal groups that are attacking human rights defenders, former combatants, and communities. Their task is to develop policies that will identify and bring to justice not just the perpetrators of the crimes, but also, importantly, the authors of the crimes. The National Commission of Security Guarantees is one of the few inclusive mechanisms with representatives from civil society organisations, as well as high-level government decision makers. The inclusive nature of this commission adds to its legitimacy. However, this body has not been functioning during the Duque government, meeting only 7 times when it should have met monthly. However, on the positive side, transitional justice system has been established and is functioning. It is made up of the Truth Commission, the Search Unit for the Disappeared, and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the Justice Tribunal. The Truth Commission report will be launched in June. However, it's actually going to need a lot of international support, as the Truth Commissioners tell us that the report is likely to upset everyone. The Justice Tribunal is moving ahead with a range of national cases, which are politically very difficult and complex. It held quite an important event this month where army commanders and some army commanders and soldiers admitted to a systematic practice of extrajudicial killings known as false positive. However, whilst there are a wide range of national cases that have been accepted by the Justice Tribunal, a national case on women and complex sexual violence is not one of them, as Linda explained in her presentation. A lot will be at stake when Colombia heads to the polls in May, and it is unlikely that any candidate will achieve over 50% of the vote. This means that there will be a second round, and this is likely to be 2 polarizing candidates in a runoff. These 2 candidates offer very different visions for the future. Gustavo Petro, a left-wing senator and former mayor of Bogotá, wants to overhaul Colombia's economic and social model, moving away from fossil fuels and mining, strengthening government institutions in areas such as health, education, social security, and supporting local industries and agriculture. Federico Gutierrez, known as Fico, a right-wing former mayor of Medellin, is likely to continue in the footsteps of President Duque, and it will be business as usual. In terms of winning the election, he is playing off a long-standing fear that Colombians will become economically a second Venezuela, a fear campaign that gained many votes in the last election for the current president. Colombia at this moment in time is particularly polarized, and either candidate is likely to cause concern for half of the population. If Fico wins, we are likely to see growing social discontent and social protest, and the implementation of the peace accord, especially chapters that are important for victims like the rural reform chapter, is not likely to be prioritized. On the other hand, organizations behind the social protest will have very high expectations of Petro, but he is likely to have difficulties in getting his policies through Congress, and there are concerns from the economic elite as to what his policies will be for business. Really, I think it's quite problematic for Colombia that there is such a polarization in these elections. Just to sum up and offer some recommendations, there are some Kaywe, could you put the recommendations up, please? There are some really important advances in the implementation of the peace accord. Where there is slow and little implementation are the chapters that matter most to victims. And the greatest threat to the peace process is the security situation and the reconfiguration of conflict in the rural areas. Going forward, there are key priorities for the international community. One is that the Security Council level, that they have a mechanism that allows for groups of experts to be appointed. And right now, Colombia needs a group of experts to support the National Commission of Security Guarantees, to develop effective policies for the dismantling of paramilitary and other criminal groups, and especially to assist and support the civil society representatives on this commission, which include Linda. Another key priority is a national case on conflict-related sexual violence in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the Justice Tribunal. And Linda really articulated very clearly why that is absolutely essential. I think it's not only essential for the Colombian peace process, but also because it will set a precedence on a global scale for what can happen in these cases. And thirdly, it will be essential to move the police force out of the Ministry of Defence and to ensure a change of culture for policing during peace building. Thanks, Paul.